Good morning dear students, welcome to today's video class. So in the last class we are discussing regarding what is actually the biodiversity. Biodiversity refers to presence of varieties of organisms in a given habitat, isn't it? And we have seen in order to have this or the biodiversity richness, mainly because of the three things. One is the differences in the genetic constituent, differences in the species, and differences in the ecological parameters, isn't it? So we have three types of the biodiversities, right? So genetic biodiversity, species biodiversity, and as well as ecological biodiversity. And also we have studied what actually the global biodiversity and also the biodiversity in India also. So anyhow, so this richness of the organisms or richness of the biodiversity so varies from place to place, and the conditions are also playing a major role. So let's see how it varies both latitudinally and as well as altitudinally, right? See here, if we go through these, the species richness or occurrence of the species all along the latitude. That means if we move from equator to polar, either in the northern hemisphere side or southern hemisphere side, the species richness declines. That means, so in other words, so what I mean to say is, at the equator, the species richness is more. So, and the species richness declines as we move from equator to the polar regions. See, we are having one of the typical example, that is, so the bird, that is the bird's distribution. So in the three zones, three places, so signify how actually what we call it as the ecological parameters are playing major role. Right? So in Colombia, so it is situated at the equator, has 1,400 species of birds. Whereas New York is situated at the 41-degree northern hemisphere, where the bird species is less compared to Colombia, that is 105 species. If we move further towards northern side, that is in the Greenland, it is situated at 71-degree northern hemisphere. So where there is hardly 56 species of birds are found. So what it signifies? So the species richness declines when we move from equator towards polar side, either right side or towards the left side, right? So even in case of the plants also, this is what we have studied in case of the birds. So even if we consider the plants also, the plants distribution also declines from equator to polar region. So at the equator there is nearly about 10 times more than that of the plant species that are found at the polar region, because the equator is the place where all the ecological parameters are at an optimum range, whether it may be a light, so in that light, so intensity of the light, duration of the light rays, so then what we are having, the temperature, so then soil condition, then the gases, pH, so all these ecological parameters at the equator are at the optimum range. So hence we find high biodiversity at the equator region. So in the polar region, the intensity of the light declines, right? And the temperature also decline. So because of that, the species richness is less, right? So even the species richness also varies when we move altitudinally, right? So at what we are having the tropical region, there is the maximum number of species are found, right, at the tropical region, that is at lower altitude at the tropic region. So there is rich in the biodiversity. So at a higher altitude, the species diversity declines, right? So at the tropical region, the species richness is more. At the higher altitude region like the alpine regions anta karitare. So in that alpine regions, the species richness is less, right? So these are the two criteria where we find the difference in the distribution of the organisms, right? So the distribution of the organisms varies both latitudinal movement and also altitudinal movement. Why? Because of the variation in the ecological parameters or environmental conditions. So environmental conditions are playing a major role in the survivability of the organisms, right? These are the 2 points, just you keep it in your mind. Then, so Humboldt is the scientist who tried to explain the species richness by his own field study. So based on his study, so he has plotted a graph, and so when he plotted a graph, so he got what we call it as an hyperbola curve. So in this hyperbola curve, if we put a straight line to find out the slope, right? The slope of this straight line is expressed as log s is equal to log c plus z log a, where the s means species richness, c means, so it is the y-intercept, z means slope of the line, and a is the area. So when he plotted a graph against area against the species richness, so he obtained the hyperbola curve. So what did this curve or what this equation says? So according to this Humboldt, right, the species richness increases with the increase in the area, right? So it's quite common. So ಎಲ್ಲೇ ಆಗಲಿ ಏರಿಯಾ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಆದಾಗೆ ಸ್ಪೀಸೀಸ್ ರಿಚ್ನೆಸ್ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಆಗ್ತದೆ. Just for example, so if we study the what we call it as the biodiversity or the plant species that are present in a garden or in a park, right? And also if we study the plant studies or plants biodiversity in entire city, if we study the plant distribution or the plant's occurrence in the entire state and in the entire nation, right? So as and when the area is get enlarged, the occurrence of the plant species also increases, right? So according to him, so as and when the area increases, so what will happen? The slope of the straight line so become steeper and steeper. So with his equation and with this graph, he made a conclusion that so whenever the area of the organism's distribution is small, so the organism's distribution or occurrence of the organism is less, right? Area, if it is get increased, the species diversity also increases. See here, the value of Z. So what is that Z? So Z is the slope of the line, right? So slope of the line is calculated by having this equation. So the value of the Z ranges from 0 to 1, 0.1 to 0.2. So yavaga, so when the area is small. If the area is large, the slope of the line is much steeper, that is the Z value will increase from 0.6 to 1.2, right? So in a smaller area, the species richness is, or the Z value is 0.1 to 0.2. So if the area is increased, so like it is large, that means if we consider the entire continental region, right? So if the area increased to continental region, then automatically species richness will get increases, or the Z value will get increases, which ranges from 0.6 to 1.2, right? So these are some of the aspects how actually the organism's distribution varies from place to place, right? And what is the role which is being played by the area of a given place. Then, so we shall study the another most important aspect. So with reference to the species diversity that are present in an ecosystem. So in an ecosystem, we come across there is a continuous interaction between the abiotic and biotic components. What abiotic components indicate? Abiotic component indicates the non-living components of the ecosystem. Non-living components of the ecosystem includes light, temperature, water, gases, soil parameters. So these are all constitute abiotic components. Biotic components includes the producers, consumers and decomposers. Producers means plants, consumers means the animals, and decomposers includes the microbes, right? So in the ecosystem, we are having a continuous interaction between the abiotic and biotic components, and also among the biotic components also we are having the interaction which we have already studied in the last chapter, that is organisms interaction. So in that organisms interactions, so we have studied the parasitism. So parasitism, where one organism will get the food from the another organism, right? So the parasite gets the food from the host. The parasite depends on the host. Similarly, predation, where the predator gets the food from by eating the prey, right? So predator eat the prey. Similarly, in case of the mutualism, where both the partners are equally benefited, where both the partners are what we are having, they are living together with mutual cooperation and coordination without harming anyone, right? So this is how among the living organisms in an ecosystem, they live with interaction, with mutual coordination. In the last video class itself, I told you, right? So in this ecosystem, among the biotic components of the ecosystem, so man is the only cruel animal, most selfish animal. So because of his selfishness or his survivability, so this man is altering the components of the ecosystem. So hence we are facing so many the devastating effects like the volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, floods. All these are the dangerous effects are faced by the ecosystem because of the anthropogenic activity or the intervention of the human activities. See here, so that means, so in an ecosystem, each and every organism is important. So in order to understand this concept, right? So importance of species diversity in an ecosystem, right? So in order to understand this one, we are having one hypothesis or one beautiful concept, that is what we call it as Rivet-Popper hypothesis. ಬಹಳ ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ಅಂದರೆ ಬಹಳ ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟ್, ಇದು 3 ಮಾರ್ಕ್ಸ್ಗೆ ಕೇಳ್ತಾರೆ ಇದನ್ನ, ರೈಟ್? ಸೊ ಮೋಸ್ಟ್ ಈಸಿಯೆಸ್ಟ್ ಕ್ವಶನ್ ಯು ಆರ್ ಹ್ಯಾವಿಂಗ್. ಸೊ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಪ್ಲೈನ್ ದ Rivet-Popper hypothesis. So why we are having this hypothesis? In order to know, in order to understand each and every organism, each and every species that is present in an ecosystem is most important. No organism should be neglected, right? So what this concept says, so according to this hypothesis, if we consider an aeroplane, that aeroplane has so many structures like the wings, then driver seat, then passenger seats, then windows, right? So we are having so many different components or structures or the what we call it as these accessories, right? So our compartments are parts of an aeroplane. So while the passengers, while they are traveling in that aeroplane, if they keep on removing the what we call it as the rivets. What this rivet? So it is nothing but the screws, right? So the screws are fixed to the seats where the passengers are seated, and the screws are fixed to the windows of the aeroplane. Then the screws are fixed to the wings of the aeroplane, isn't it? And the screws are fixed to the what we call it as the door of the aeroplane. So if the passengers who are sitting in the aeroplane, if they go on removing these rivets one after the other, one after the other, one after the other, right? So while removal of these rivets from their respective places or from the respective parts of the aeroplane, initially, so the aeroplane doesn't feel any problem, right? So don't have any problem in the flying of that aeroplane. So if the passengers go on removing the rivets, right, continuously, what will happen? One fine day, the entire aeroplane will get collapses. So automatically that will affect the passengers who are seated in that aeroplane. So what it says? So it says that this concept says that, or they give a clarity that in that aeroplane each and every part is most important, and those parts are found together with the help of these rivets. So because of the removal of the rivets one after the other, so these parts become dislodged. So because of the dislodgement of the wings, right, so aeroplane could not fly, or flying aeroplane may get collapse, and ultimately death of the passengers occurs. So this is how in an ecosystem, whatever the different types of organisms, so it has been estimated that the entire biosphere contains nearly about more than 20 million species. Till today, we human beings identified hardly about 1.4 to 1.6 million species. Still we are having so many unidentified organisms, right? So among these organisms, so there occur the interaction. So if we eliminate these different species that are present in an ecosystem, why the elimination of the organisms occur? Because of the human activities. See, human being, in order to survive, he is constructing the dams, he is destroying the forest, then he is constructing the buildings, he is constructing the roads, so and he is destructing the forest in order to have the cultivation, right? So automatically what it leads? It leads to the extinction of the species. So you might have studied in your high school, right? So we have lost so many organisms from this biosphere because of the human intervention, right? So this concept says that, right, each and every organism is most important. If we go on eliminate the organisms from the ecosystem, one or the other day, entire ecosystem will get destabilized or entire ecosystem will get destroyed, including the human being, right? So this is one of the wonderful concept we are having, that is Rivett-Popper hypothesis. Let's see what are the points you are supposed to write when they ask the Rivett-Popper hypothesis. So this Rivett-Popper hypothesis was proposed by Paul Ehrlich, right? So according to him, so each and every organism is important, that is present in the ecosystem, right? He proposed this hypothesis to explain the importance of different species that is present in an ecosystem. So in an aeroplane, all parts, as I already told you, the wings, then the doors, windows, seats, so all these different parts, so which are joined together by the structures called screws. So these screws are called rivets, and these rivets are compared to the species of ecosystem. Then, so if the passengers who are traveling in this aeroplane, if they go on removing these rivets or screws one after the other, right? So at the initial stage, initially there was no problem for the aeroplane flight. Then continuous removal of the rivets led the improper functioning of the aeroplane, and ultimately the entire aeroplane will get collapses and leads to the death of the so many people who are traveling in that aeroplane. Similarly, so in an ecosystem, so each and every species is important, right? So because of the human anthropogenic activities, what are these anthropogenic activities? So construction of dams, buildings, extension of the agriculture, roads, right? So these are the anthropogenic activities. Then mining, right? So these anthropogenic activities so causes the what we call it as extinction of the species that are present in the ecosystem one after the other. One fine day, so we are going to have entire collapse of the ecosystem, including the human beings, right? So these are the points you are supposed to write if they ask this Rivett-Popper hypothesis. Okay. Next we shall discuss, so what are the cause for the depletion of the biodiversity ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಸೊ ಈಗ ನಮಗೇನು ಗೊತ್ತಾಯಿತು ಬಯೋಡೈವರ್ಸಿಟಿ ಅಂದರೆ ಏನು, ಸೊ ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ಏನೇನಿರುತ್ತೆ varieties of organisms, right? So each and every organism is important ಅನ್ನೋದು ಈ Rivett-Popper hypothesis ಇಂದ ಗೊತ್ತಾಯಿತು. Next we shall discuss, so what are the causes for the depletion of biodiversity. ಸೊ ನಮ್ಮಲ್ಲಿರುವಂಥ ಬಯೋಡೈವರ್ಸಿಟಿ ಹಾಳಾಗೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಏನೇನು ಕಾರಣ, ದಟ್ ಈಸ್ ಒನ್ ಆಫ್ ದಿ ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟ್ long answer question, right? Easy question adu kuda, right? And the another hand we will going to study what are the importance or significance of the biodiversity. Biodiversity ಇಂದ ಏನು ಉಪಯೋಗ, ಬಯೋಡೈವರ್ಸಿಟಿ ಹಾಳಾಗೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಏನೇನು ಕಾರಣ. Okay, so we shall discuss these things in the next upcoming video class.